A mother and son found a huge swarm of bees in their garden. But when the experts arrived, their expressions immediately changed. What was hidden in the tree turned out to be far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The small house at the edge of town stood quietly beneath the heavy summer air, its wooden frame weathered by years of heat, rain, and southern winds. For the woman who lived there with her son, the house was more than four walls and a roof. It was the place where her life had unraveled and been stitched back together again after loss. Her husband had died years before, leaving her to raise their child alone. Though she had carried on with work, with the daily rhythm of cooking, cleaning, and tending to her boy, there were days when the silence inside those rooms pressed too heavily against her chest, reminding her of the absence that no words could ever fill. The garden behind the house was her refuge. Rows of beans and tomatoes, a scatter of marigolds, and the scent of wild mint gave her a sense of purpose when the nights felt too long. But there was one tree that mattered more than the rest of the garden combined. In the center of the yard stood an old apple tree, planted by her husband not long after they were married. She remembered the day he had pressed the young sapling into the earth, his hands stained with soil, his face glowing with the certainty of a man building something for the future. Over the years, that tree had grown tall and broad, its branches reaching over the fence as if trying to shelter them all. Every season brought apples, and every season she and her son gathered them into baskets. In those moments, laughter returned to the house. The boy climbed the lower branches, dropping fruit into her apron, while she scolded him gently for shaking the limbs too hard. The apples were never perfect, often bruised or misshapen, but they carried the sweetness of memory. Each bite tasted like the echo of her husband's presence, a reminder that he had left behind something that continued to grow. The woman had always thought of the apple tree as alive in more than the ordinary sense. It was a piece of her husband that the world had not managed to take away. On quiet evenings, she would sit beneath it, her fingers brushing the grass, and she would remember his voice, his laughter, the way he had leaned against the trunk on summer afternoons. For her son, too young to recall his father clearly, the tree was a connection to a man he only knew through stories. It was not just wood and leaves, it was memory anchored in the soil. One afternoon, as the sun pressed down hard enough to make the air shimmer, she heard something unusual near the tree. At first it was faint, like the murmur of distant machinery. But as she walked closer, the sound became distinct, a low droning hum that seemed to vibrate in the air. She paused, squinting into the branches. The apple tree's trunk had a hollow near its base, a place where time had carved out a rough cavity. Now that hollow was alive with movement. Bees swarmed in and out of the dark opening, their golden bodies glinting as they darted through the shafts of sunlight. Her breath caught at the sight. For a long moment she simply stood still, watching the stream of insects, the air thick with their restless energy. It seemed as though the tree itself had begun to breathe, to pulse with life far beyond its bark and leaves. Her son, drawn by the sound, came running into the garden, and when he saw the bees, his face lit up with wonder. The two of them stood side by side, and in her chest there rose a complicated swell of feelings, part awe, part unease. At first she chose to see it as a gift. Bees in the garden meant pollination, meant fruit more plentiful than ever before. She told herself that her husband would have smiled at the sight, pleased to see his tree still nurturing life. Yet behind that thought there lurked a trace of worry. The hum was not gentle but insistent, vibrating against her ears, settling into her bones. The bees were not scattered wanderers but a collective force, moving with intention as they vanished into the hollow and emerged again, carrying their invisible burdens. Days passed, and the swarm grew thicker. Each evening the tree seemed louder, the drone rising with the heat that lingered even after sunset. Her son spent long stretches staring at them, as though hypnotized, while she worked in the rows of beans and tomatoes, with one eye always turned toward the apple tree. The bees never crossed into open aggression, but the very sight of their numbers carried a weight that pressed on her nerves. She found herself hesitant to walk too near, skirting the trunk when she passed, unwilling to disturb whatever vast activity unfolded within. The garden, once a place of gentle rhythms, began to feel altered. Where before there had been the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, now the air vibrated with constant motion. At dusk, when she watered the plants, the setting sun slanted across the tree and lit the bees in a golden haze, transforming the yard into a scene that was both beautiful and disquieting. It was as if her husband's tree had awakened into something she could no longer fully understand. Her son spoke of it with excitement, calling the swarm a miracle. For him, it was proof that the tree was more than wood, that it was alive in ways that stretched beyond memory. She smiled at his enthusiasm, but behind the smile she carried a knot of unease. She could not deny that the bees had turned the tree into something unfamiliar, something that no longer belonged entirely to her or to the past she cherished. The nights grew restless. Through the open windows, she could sometimes hear the drone drifting into the dark, blending with the cicadas in the trees. It was not loud, not enough to keep her awake, but it was constant, a reminder that just outside her walls, a colony was expanding, carving out its dominion inside the hollow, where her husband's sapling had once stood straight and young. She told herself it was nothing, that bees were a part of life, but the thought refused to soothe her. One evening she carried a basket of laundry into the garden and stopped midway across the yard. The hum was heavier than before, the sound carrying a strange resonance, as though the very air had thickened. The tree stood tall, its branches heavy with green leaves, and yet it seemed changed, its presence more commanding, more alive than it had any right to be. She set the basket down slowly, watching the bees circle in restless arcs. The garden had always been her sanctuary, the one place where she could keep the world at bay. Now, with the tree transformed into a hive, that sanctuary had begun to shift beneath her feet. She tried to shake off the thought, bending back to her chores, but every movement drew her gaze once more to the apple tree. Her husband's gift, the living memory she had tended for years, was no longer simply hers. It had become something larger, something buzzing with a power she could neither control nor ignore. By the end of that first week, she could no longer look at the tree without feeling a quiet tension rise in her chest. The bees had claimed it, and though she had told herself they were only insects, only a part of nature's endless cycle, she could not shake the sense that her garden, her refuge, was no longer the same. The apple tree still stood as the symbol of her husband's presence, but it now carried another meaning as well, one of restless change, of a life growing within it that was not her own. And as she stood one evening beneath the bruised colors of twilight, her son laughing softly at the sight of bees drifting in the fading light, she felt the shift fully. The apple tree was still memory, still love, still grief. But now it was also mystery, a living force that had transformed her quiet garden into something strange and uncertain. It was the beginning of a change she could sense but not yet name, a change that would test her heart and her courage in ways she could not foresee. The days that followed seemed to stretch longer than before, filled with a tension that weighed on the woman in ways she could not quite explain. The garden, once her place of peace, had changed its nature. The apple tree in the center stood the same as always in shape and height, yet it was no longer simply a tree. It had become a living hive, a host for countless bees that had claimed it as their own. And with every passing day, the sound grew louder and the air grew heavier with their presence. The swarm did not merely fill the hollow, it seemed to spread outward, thickening in number, as if the tree itself had transformed into a great organ, pumping life into the air around it. Her son remained fascinated. Each morning he would step onto the porch, stand at the edge of the yard, and watch the bees hover and whirl. His eyes carried a brightness she had not seen in a long time, as though he found in the hive a secret that belonged only to him. He whispered once, in his own quiet way, that it was like the tree had found a new heart. She had no reply for him. For her, the sound was not comforting. It pressed into her ears, into her chest, a constant reminder that the garden was no longer hers alone. The bees moved with a discipline that unsettled her. They did not wander idly but flew in precise arcs, as if patrolling the space around the hollow. They clustered in golden sheets that covered the bark, shimmering like a living veil before breaking apart again to rise into the sky. Sometimes, when she bent to tend her tomatoes, she felt the hum vibrating through the soil, subtle but insistent, as though the entire yard were connected to the hive. At night, lying awake in her bed, she could still hear it, muted by distance but unceasing. It became a kind of second pulse, a rhythm that intruded even into her dreams. The neighbors soon began to notice. One afternoon, she found a note slipped under the gate, written in an uncertain hand. They asked whether she had seen how large the hive had become, whether she was aware that the bees had begun to cross into their yards. She crumpled the note in her hand, though her heart beat faster with guilt and apprehension. Later, from her kitchen window, she saw a neighbor leading a small dog on a leash, the animal snapping at the air as bees darted near its face. The woman hurried the dog inside, throwing a sharp glance across the fence toward the apple tree. It was undeniable. The swarm was no longer a curiosity confined to her garden. It had become a presence that stretched outward, unsettling the fragile order of their quiet street. Her son continued to watch in wonder, but even he grew cautious, learning to keep his distance, sensing the guarded energy of the hive. She warned him without words, pulling him back gently whenever he drew too near. By the end of the second week, the apple tree looked altered. Its trunk, once scarred but sturdy, now seemed cloaked in a restless skin of movement. The hollow at its base was invisible beneath the mass of insects, a churning darkness alive with wings. The branches above still bore leaves, but they seemed secondary now, almost ornamental, as though the true life of the tree had shifted into the hive within. The apples that had begun to form hung small and shriveled, as if the energy of the tree had been consumed by the colony that filled its hollow heart. She felt a growing dread she could not ignore. There were moments when she paused in her work, spade in hand, and simply stared at the tree, the sound vibrating through the humid air until it felt like the very ground trembled beneath her shoes. She tried to convince herself that it was still the same apple tree her husband had planted, that the hive was only another phase of life, but her conviction faltered each time the swarm rose in a sudden cloud, blotting out the quiet sky with its golden fury. One morning, as she watered her beans, she saw a neighbor child approach the fence, drawn by curiosity. The boy stretched a hand toward the buzzing hollow. She dropped the can, water spilling into the dirt, and ran across the yard to wave him away. He fled, startled, and she stood breathless at the fence, her heart pounding as she watched the bees shiver and hum in response to the disturbance. From that moment, she knew she could no longer pretend the swarm was harmless. That evening, she sat at the table long after her son had gone to bed, staring at the darkened window. The hum seeped through the glass, persistent, inescapable. She thought of her husband planting the sapling, his hands steady, his face filled with quiet pride. She thought of the apples they had gathered year after year, of the laughter beneath its branches. Now all of that seemed overshadowed, consumed by the restless presence that had taken root in the hollow. The tree was still there, but the memory she cherished had been replaced by something foreign, something she could not trust. The next day she made the call. Her voice shook as she explained what had happened. The hive, the numbers, the fear in her neighbors' faces. Hours later, a truck pulled into the drive, and two men stepped out carrying suits and equipment. They moved with the practiced calm of those who had seen such things before. She led them to the garden, her hands clenched tight around her apron, her son trailing behind her in silence. The men studied the tree from a cautious distance. One leaned close, shining a light into the hollow, then straightened with a frown. They murmured to each other in low voices. When they turned back, their faces were grave. The trunk, they explained, was hollow from root to branch. The wood had rotted long ago, leaving nothing but a brittle shell. The bees had filled the emptiness with their hive, building their world inside the carcass of the tree. The truth was simple. The apple tree had been dead for years. The woman listened in silence, her chest tightening. She had known the bark was scarred, the branches weaker with each season, but she had never allowed herself to believe that the tree itself was gone. She had clung to it as though her husband still stood beside it, as though its roots held the memory of his hands. Now the reality struck with brutal clarity. The tree she had loved was no longer there. Only its husk remained, kept upright by the ceaseless work of the swarm. That night she sat by the window with the curtains half drawn, watching the hive tremble in the darkness. The sound seemed louder than ever, filling her home, filling her body until she could hardly breathe. Her son slept upstairs, his dreams perhaps filled with wonder, but her own mind was heavy with grief. The apple tree had been her last living tether to the man she had lost, and now she knew it was already gone, its body hollow, its heart consumed by another force entirely. The hum of the swarm pressed through the silence of the house, and she realized she was listening not to the voice of her husband's memory, but to the voice of something else altogether, something alive, restless, and utterly beyond her control. The garden no longer belonged to her, and the peace she had once known there had vanished into the wings of countless bees that pulsed in and out of the hollow. She closed her eyes, and for the first time she understood that her sanctuary had become a place of unease. The house was quiet that night, but the silence was restless rather than peaceful. The woman sat by the window long after her son had gone to bed, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were pale. Outside, the garden loomed under the weight of the moon, and at its center the apple tree stood as a dark silhouette, alive not with its own strength, but with the ceaseless trembling of the hive within. The words of the specialist repeated in her mind again and again, each one pressing against her chest like a stone. The tree was gone. It had been hollowed long ago, its body nothing more than a shell for the swarm that had claimed it. For years she had believed she was tending to a living connection with her husband, the sapling he had planted in their first season of marriage. But now she knew the truth. The tree she loved had been gone, and she had only clung to a memory that the bees had taken as their home. In the days that followed, she could not shake the weight of that revelation. Each time she entered the garden, she felt both drawn and repelled by the apple tree. The bees still moved with their relentless rhythm, streaming in and out of the hollow, coating the bark like a living skin. Her son still watched them with awe, but his wonder no longer brought her comfort. Instead, it reminded her of how fragile their place here had become. The neighbors had grown wary, whispering across fences and avoiding the side of the street nearest her home. The swarm was no longer a curiosity, but a threat, and she could see it in their narrowed eyes and hushed tones. Her heart wrestled with itself. One part of her longed to preserve the tree no matter what, to let the bees live inside its hollow trunk because it still stood as a monument to her husband's hands. But another part, stronger with each passing night, told her that this clinging was dangerous. The tree could fall. Its shell was brittle, the ground beneath it unsteady, and when it went, it might strike the house or harm her son. To hold on to memory at the cost of safety felt like a betrayal of the very man she grieved, for he had planted the tree to give them life, not to endanger it. The specialists returned one morning, their faces lined with a quiet concern that needed no words. They reminded her of the risks, speaking carefully but firmly. The trunk could not be saved. It was hollow to its core, and the swarm within made it impossible to treat or brace. The hive was not something that could be moved without danger, and the neighbors were pressing for action. She listened in silence, her head bowed, her hands trembling at her sides. When they finished, she thanked them with a hollow voice, though she knew their words left no room for hope. That afternoon she stood in the garden alone, the summer sun pressing hard upon her back, and stared at the apple tree until her vision blurred. She thought of the day her husband had planted it, the way he had laughed as he tamped the soil around its roots. She thought of the seasons when its branches had bowed with fruit, the afternoons when their son had climbed its limbs while she watched from the porch. Every memory seemed bound to its bark, every echo of her life with him rooted in the soil beneath. To see it gone felt impossible. It was not just wood she was losing, but a part of her soul. Yet the voices of reason grew stronger with each glance at her son. She could not ask him to live in fear, to grow in a garden dominated by a swarm that might turn hostile at the slightest provocation. She could not pretend that the tree was alive when its heart had long since decayed. It was not her husband she would be bearing, only the illusion that he still lingered in the bark and branches. Still, the decision tasted like betrayal. The morning she finally agreed was heavy with heat. The air was thick, the sky white with sun, and the men came with their tools and their suits, their expressions grave but professional. Her son stayed close to her side, sensing the weight of the moment, though he did not fully understand. She held his hand, her eyes fixed on the tree, and gave a slow nod when the foreman asked if she was ready. The sound of engines flared to life, and the garden filled with a noise more violent than any she had known. The bees rose at once, an angry cloud that blackened the air around the tree. Their hum was deafening, a roar that seemed to shake the ground. The men advanced carefully in their protective gear, the saws biting into the brittle wood. The woman's heart clenched with every cut. Her breath caught as the trunk shuddered beneath the assault. The swarm surged outward, circling in a furious storm, but the men held steady, their movements practiced and unyielding. The moment the tree cracked was like a fracture through her own chest. The trunk split with a groan, and the upper branches tilted, then crashed to the ground with a weight that rattled the earth. She felt her knees weaken, her hand gripping her son's tightly as the bees screamed their fury into the air. It was as though the tree's death was her husband's death all over again, a second burial of the life she had once known. The workers moved swiftly, cutting the branches, dragging them aside, reducing the fallen giant into pieces of wood and hive. The bees swarmed relentlessly, their golden bodies catching the light as they circled, unwilling to let go of their home. The woman watched through a blur of tears, her chest aching as the men dismantled what had once been her heart's anchor. The air was thick with the smell of cut wood and smoke from the repellents they used, a bitter mixture that stung her throat. When the last section of the trunk gave way, collapsing into a heap of shattered bark and exposed comb, the garden fell strangely silent. The swarm lingered in the air, uncertain, but the structure that had held them was gone. The hollow that had once been the center of her memory now lay open and broken, a reminder of how much had already slipped from her grasp. She sank to her knees in the grass, her hands covering her face, and let the grief wash over her. Her son stood beside her, quiet but steady, his presence the only thing keeping her from dissolving completely. She felt his hand on her shoulder, small but grounding, and in that moment she understood that though the apple tree was gone, though the last living tie to her husband had been cut and dragged away, something still remained. It was not in the bark or the roots, but in the boy who carried his father's memory forward, in the life they had built together, fragile though it was. The day passed in a blur of noise and labor, and when the men finally left, the garden was transformed. Where once the apple tree had stood, only a scarred patch of earth remained, littered with fragments of wood and abandoned comb. The bees circled aimlessly before drifting away, their sound fading into the distance. The woman sat by the stump until the sun set, her hands resting against the rough bark that was left, her heart heavy with sorrow. It felt like a betrayal, like a wound that would never close. Yet beneath the grief, there was a faint glimmer of understanding. Memory was not bound to the tree alone. It lived in her son, and in the love that had once planted the sapling in that soil. But in that hour, she could not yet embrace that truth. All she could feel was the loss, raw and unrelenting, as if the garden itself had turned against her. The apple tree, once her sanctuary, lay broken at her feet, and she knew her life would never again be the same. The days after the apple tree was felled seemed to stretch into a silence that weighed more heavily than the sound of the swarm ever had. The garden, once alive with the ceaseless hum of bees, now stood still and barren, its center scarred by the absence of the tree that had been both her burden and her sanctuary. The ground where it had fallen was marked with splinters and scattered comb, the remnants of what had once been a living hive, and before that, the living memory of her husband. For the woman, each glance at the empty space struck like a reminder of a wound that could not heal, a space in her life that nothing seemed capable of filling. She walked the garden slowly, her steps hesitant, as though the land itself might protest her intrusion. The marigolds at the borders had wilted, their bright faces dulled by heat and neglect. The beans sagged against their supports, and the tomatoes hung small and dry, for in those days she had scarcely lifted her watering can. She had tended the garden for years as though it were a piece of her soul, but now the sight of it felt foreign, hostile even, as if the land resented her for allowing the apple tree to be cut down. She would pause by the stump, running her hand along its rough edge, and the ache inside her would rise anew. To her, it felt less like wood and more like the tombstone of a life she had once known. The sense of betrayal did not leave her easily. She had agreed to the cutting, she had watched the men dismantle the tree, and yet her heart rebelled against her own decision. Each time she touched the stump, she whispered apologies in her mind, as though her husband could hear her and know she had not destroyed the tree out of indifference, but out of necessity. Still, guilt clung to her like a shadow, reminding her that she had been the one to nod her consent, to say the word that ended the only living remnant of his hand in the soil. At night, the silence in the house pressed down with new weight. Where once the hum of the bees had seeped into her dreams, now there was only stillness, and in that stillness her grief echoed louder. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts wandering back to the days when her husband had been alive, when the garden had been filled with his laughter. She remembered him leaning on the shovel, the young sapling beside him, his eyes alight with the simple pride of creating something that would outlast him. She had believed it had done so. Only now did she realize that time had eroded it long before the saws arrived, that she had clung to a memory dressed in leaves and bark long after its heart had turned hollow. Her son, though quiet, became her anchor in those heavy days. He did not speak of the tree in the way she did, nor did he dwell on the sound of the swarm that had filled their lives for weeks. Instead, he moved through the house with a steady patience, his presence a reminder that though they had lost something, not all was gone. She watched him sometimes as he played in the yard, his steps tentative at first, circling the stump as though it were a forbidden relic, before growing more confident, reclaiming the space that fear and bees had once denied him. In his resilience, she found a glimmer of strength, though she scarcely admitted it to herself. One evening, she returned from the clinic where she worked, her body heavy with the fatigue of tending to others, and she found her son crouched by the stump with a small trowel in his hand. He had cleared away some of the splinters and weeds that had begun to creep close, leaving the ground bare and ready. She stood watching him from the porch, her breath catching at the sight. He looked up, and though he said nothing, the meaning was clear. He was preparing for something new. It was not until later, when the dusk deepened and the cicadas began their song, that she allowed herself to consider it fully. The apple tree had been her husband's gift, the living echo of his love, and its loss had reopened her grief. Yet perhaps the true gift had not been the tree itself, but the act of planting it, the faith that life could be nurtured and passed on. That act could be repeated. The soil was scarred but still fertile, and within it lay the possibility of growth. Her son's small hands in the dirt were proof of that. She knelt beside him the next morning, the sun still low, and together they cleared the ground more carefully. The air smelled of earth and dew, and though the stump loomed nearby, it no longer felt like a monument of despair. Instead, it was a reminder of what had been, a marker of where love had once taken root. The boy's eyes shone with eagerness, and as she watched him work, she realized that planting anew would not erase the past but would carry it forward. The day they placed the sapling into the ground, the sky was overcast, the heat softened by a veil of gray. She guided her son's hands as they set the roots into the soil, pressing the earth gently around them. The act was simple, but to her it carried the weight of years. It was as if she were speaking to her husband through the soil itself, telling him that his legacy would not be lost. The new tree would grow not in his stead, but because of him, because of the love he had given and the life they had shared. For the first time in many weeks, she felt a measure of peace. The garden was still wounded, its beds weary, its flowers wilted, but the sapling stood upright, fragile yet promising. She watered it with care, her hands steady, her breath deep and calm. The boy looked up at her, his face bright, and in his gaze she saw both the shadow of the man she had lost and the future that still lay ahead. The nights grew easier after that. Though the silence remained, it no longer pressed upon her with such suffocating weight. She would sit by the window and watch the sapling sway in the evening breeze, its leaves small but vibrant, and she would feel the ache in her chest soften. The memory of the old apple tree, with its hollow trunk and furious swarm, did not vanish, but it became something she could bear. It was a story now, a part of her life she could recall without drowning. The boy began to speak of the new tree as theirs, not his father's alone, but something they had made together. And she found comfort in that, for it meant that memory did not need to live only in what had been left behind, but also in what could be built anew. The act of planting was as much an inheritance as the tree itself. Years would pass, and the sapling would grow, its branches reaching outward to shade the garden once more. Perhaps one day it would bear fruit, and when it did, she and her son would gather it together as they once had beneath the old apple tree. The sweetness of those apples would carry not only the memory of her husband, but also the resilience of their own lives. Proof that loss need not end in emptiness, but could give way to hope. For now, as she stood in the garden at dusk, the air warm and still, she laid her hand against the tender bark of the young tree and closed her eyes. The grief of the past weeks had not vanished, but it no longer consumed her. The garden, though scarred, was alive again. And in that fragile life, she felt the presence of her husband still, not bound to the hollow trunk that had been cut away, but carried forward in the living roots that would grow beneath her feet. The apple tree that once had been was gone. But in its place, a new beginning stirred, and with it came the quiet promise that memory and love, though tested by time and sorrow, could endure in the living soil of tomorrow. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next story. Check out our other videos right now for more powerful stories you won't want to miss. And please share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.